Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on something vital inside your phone, the mobile chipset.
Yeah, the brains of the operation.
Exactly. And we've got an article that looks at two new mid-range chips that, popped up this summer, Qualcomm's Snapdragon 7's Gen 3.
And the Dimensity 7300 from MediaTek.
Right. And this source puts them head-to-head. Specs, benchmarks, the works.
That's it. It's a proper showdown.
So our mission for this deep dive really is to cut through the tech speak. What do these numbers, these features actually mean for you?
And help you figure out, which engine might be better for your next phone, depending on what you actually do with it.
Makes sense. Both are aimed squarely at that mid-range spot.
Yeah, designed for smooth performance, lag-free experience, hopefully. And they do share a foundation, both built on TSMC's 4-nanometer process. Very efficient.
But that's just scratching the surface, as the article shows.
Totally. So let's lay out the similarities first, based on the source.
Okay. Timing-wise, pretty close. Snapdragon landed in August, Dimensity back in June.
Both 2024, yeah. And we mentioned the 4mm TSMC process. That's key.
What about memory and storage?
Both support modern standards. LPDDR5 memory running up to 3.2 gigahertz. That's your phone's fast RAM.
Gotcha.
And UFS 3.1 storage, like the speedy hard drive for your apps and files. Good to see that here.
Okay. And cameras. On paper, they look kind of similar, too.
They do. The article mentions both have 12-bit ISPs image signal processors. That handles the camera sensor data.
Right.
And both support single cameras up to a huge 200 megapixels, plus 4K video at 30 frames per second.
So decent specs there. What about connectivity?
Mostly a match again. Both got 5G, naturally. Wi-Fi 6E, which is the latest Wi-Fi standard.
Faster speeds, lower latency. Yeah.
And Bluetooth 5.4. So if you just glance at the spec sheet,
you might think they're basically twins.
pretty much.
Yeah.
But this is where the article gets really interesting, the performance benchmarks.
Ah, the numbers. The source actually tested these on real phones, right?
Yes, crucial point. A Nothing Phone 3A Pro for the Snapdragon and the Nothing CMF Phone 1 for the Dimensity. And the results, well, they tell a story.
Oh, let's hear it. AnTuTu first. That's the overall score.
Yep. Snapdragon 7's Gen 3 scored 815,716.
Okay. And the Dimensity?
641,755.
Whoa. Okay, that's a noticeable difference right there. What does the article say the percentage lead is?
It flags it as a 27% overall lead for the Snapdragon in AnTuTu. Pretty solid.
And digging into the components of that score, CPU, GPU.
That's where it gets even starker. The CPU test. Snapdragon hit 275,699.
And the Dimensity?
184,894. The source calculated that as a, get this, nearly 50% boost for the Snapdragon CPU. 49%, actually.
49%? Wow, that's huge for processing power.
Similar story, though not quite as dramatic. Snapdragon scored 200,564 in the GPU test.
Okay.
Dimensity was 146,819. So the article calls that a 37% advantage for the Snapdragon's GPU.
37%. Still very significant, especially for gaming, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. Even memory performance tested better on the Snapdragon. About 20% improvement there, according to AnTuTu's memory score.
Interesting. Was anything close?
Yeah, the UX score, the user experience part, was almost identical. Snapdragon 164,998, Dimensity 164,969, virtually a tie.
Okay, so UX feels similar, but raw CPU and GPU power heavily favors the Snapdragon in AnTuTu. What about Geekbench? That's another common one.
Same pattern, basically. Snapdragon leads there, too, though maybe the gap isn't quite as wide as that huge CPU jump in AnTuTu.
What are the scores?
Single core. Snapdragon got 11,189, Dimensity 1,023.
Okay, Snapdragon ahead. Multi-core.
Snapdragon 3,356, Dimensity 2,926.
So still a clear lead for the Snapdragon across both single and multi-core in Geekbench.
Exactly. The overall takeaway from the benchmarks in the article is pretty clear. The Snapdragon 7's Gen 3 just seems to have more grunt, more headroom for heavier tasks, multitasking, based purely on these numbers.
Right, so the benchmarks show what happened, but the article digs into why, doesn't it? What's the underlying difference causing this gap?
Yeah, and this is key. Even though they're both 4mm octa-core chips, the way they're built is different. It comes down to the CPU architecture and the instruction set.
Instruction set. Like the chip's fundamental language.
Precisely. The Snapdragon 7's Gen 3 uses the newer ARM v9.2a instruction set, and its core setup is 1 plus 3 plus 4.
Meaning?
One prime core clocked highest 2.5 GHz using the Cortex-A720 design, then 3 more performance cores, also A720s, but at 2.4 GHz. And finally, 4 efficiency cores, Cortex-A520s at 1.8 GHz for background stuff.
Okay, so newer ARM v9 cores, specific roles for each group. What about the Dimensity?
It uses the older ARM v8.2a instruction set, and its configuration is a simpler 4+4.
4 big, 4 little.
Kind of. It's 4 performance cores, older Cortex-A78s at 2.5 GHz, and 4 efficiency cores, older Cortex-A55s at 2 GHz.
I see. So the Snapdragon's using newer generation cores and a potentially more flexible 1+3+4 layout compared to the Dimensity's older cores in a 4+4 setup.
Exactly, and the article strongly implies this difference in core design and instruction set is the main reason for that big CPU benchmark lead we saw for the Snapdragon. Almost 50%, remember?
Yeah, that makes sense. Newer architecture usually means more work done per clock cycle. Okay, what about the GPUs? Snapdragon has its Adreno, MediaTek uses Mali, right?
Correct. Snapdragon 7's Gen 3 has the Adreno 810. The Dimensity 7300 uses a Mali-G615 MP2.
And the benchmarks showed the Adreno ahead by about 37%.
Yep. The article suggests that while specs might look okay for the Mali on paper, the real-world, well, benchmark performance points to the Adreno 810 handling demanding graphics, like in games, better.
Both have gaming optimization software, though, right? Like modes to boost performance.
They do. Snapdragon has its elite gaming features, MediaTek has Hyper Engine, but those are software layers. The underlying hardware performance, according to these tests, favors the Adreno.
Okay, what about AI? Everything has AI now. How do the NPUs compare?
Good question. The article touches on their neural processing units. Snapdragon uses its Hexagon NPU. It's highlighted for supporting on-device generative AI.
Like creating images or text directly on the phone?
Potentially, yeah. And faster AI-powered photo editing, immersive audio features. The Dimensity uses the MediaTek NPU 655. It handles AI tasks too, but the source positions the Snapdragon as maybe having a bit more focus on those, like, cutting-edge on-device generative features.
Interesting. Let's circle back to cameras. We said the basic specs were similar, 12-bit ISP, 200 MP support, 4K 30 video. Does the article detail any finer differences?
It does. This is an area where the Snapdragon specs provided in the source seem a bit more detailed, particularly around multi-camera setups.
How so?
The Snapdragon explicitly lists support for specific configurations like a single 64 MP or dual 32 MP plus 21 MP or even triple 21 MP setups, all while enabling features like noise reduction and, importantly, zero shutter lag.
Zero shutter lag, so the photo takes the instant you tap the button.
That's the idea. No annoying delay. The article didn't have that same level of specific multi-camera configuration detail for the Dimensity chip based on the source material.
Gotcha. And specific software features for image processing.
Yeah, they both list some. The Snapdragon side mentions multi-frame noise reduction, something called AID, AI denoising engine, and deep learning face detection.
Okay. And the Dimensity.
The source highlights things like dual simultaneous video capture recording from front and back cameras at once, maybe.
Could be useful.
Also, all-pixel autofocus and AI helping with auto exposure, auto white balance, autofocus. So different feature sets being emphasized.
Right. Slightly different angles on improving the photos and videos.
Yeah.
Okay. Almost done with the tech specs. One last difference mentioned in the connectivity.
Just a small one. Relating to peak download speed over 5G or Wi-Fi, the Snapdragon 7's Gen 3 is rated at 2.9 gigabits per second peak.
And the Dimensity.
Slightly faster on paper at 3.27 gigabits per second.
Huh. Minor difference in the grand scheme, probably.
Yeah.
But interesting the Dimensity pulls slightly ahead there.
Yeah, it's the one spec where it nudged past the Snapdragon in the comparison.
Okay, so we've gone through the similarities, the benchmarks, the underlying architectural differences in CPU and GPU, AI, camera details. Taking all that into account, what was the final verdict from the source article?
Well, the conclusion was pretty clear based on their findings, while acknowledging both are strong mid-range options on that efficient 4mm process.
Which is important for battery life.
Definitely. But the article states the Snapdragon 7's Gen 3 consistently performed better across the board in their benchmark tests.
Especially CPU and GPU, right? Those nearly 50% and 37% leads.
Exactly. They point to those numbers, suggesting the Qualcomm chip just offers more raw power and perhaps more versatility with camera setups and those advanced AI features mentioned.
But they didn't totally dismiss the Dimensity.
I know, not at all. The source makes sure to say the Dimensity 7300 is still a perfectly capable and efficient chip. It'll handle everyday tasks, social media, streaming, casual gaming, just fine for most people.
It's just that if you push it harder...
The Snapdragon seems to have more performance in reserve, based on these tests. So the final word from the article was essentially, if you need that extra horsepower, maybe you're a heavier gamer, do a lot of multitasking, or value those specific camera or AI features highlighted for the Snapdragon, it's the clear winner, according to their analysis.
Right. Based on the data they presented, the performance crown goes to the Snapdragon 7's Gen 3 in this particular comparison.
That's the takeaway from the source, yes. More power under the hood.
Okay. So this brings us back to you, listening. We've unpacked what the article found the Snapdragon's edge in benchmarks, the architectural differences, the specific features.
Compared against the Dimensity, which is still a solid, efficient chip in its own right.
So the question for you is, how does this translate to your real-world phone use? Is that benchmark lead, that extra 30–50% power in certain tests, something you think you'd actually notice day to day?
Or are other things maybe more important for how you use your phone? Like maybe the specific tuning a manufacturer does, the overall software experience, battery life, and your typical usage pattern. Or maybe one specific camera feature that appeals to you more than raw horsepower.
And definitely something to think about. Do the benchmark numbers tell the whole story for your needs, or is it more nuanced than that, something to chew on?